All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and go over the last thing I notes for the Cold War with you. We need to talk about societal issues facing Western democracies, and we're also going to talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. So, everything that's considered a Western democracy is everything west of all the communist democracies. So, not the Soviet Union. So, after World War II, you had an economic boom. People were buying more things. You have the baby boom, which is your boomers today. You have a high childbirth rate and significant population increase in America. Pretty much everybody came home from World War II and they started having kids. You have suburbanization. So middle class families move from cities to the suburbs. That's just like big neighborhoods. Soldiers returning from home look to start families. They want a house, the whole white picket fence, 2.5 kids and a dog. Television. People start watching TV more. It changes the way Americans interact and get information. Instead of listening to the radio, you could watch TV. So here's a graph to show you that the baby boomer years, pretty much right after World War II until about like 1964. All right. You have the 60s, you have a lot of social reforms. President L.B. Johnson, he wanted to create the Great Society. So what he does is he increased welfare programs designed to help the needy and soldiers returning from World War II. Pretty much, he spends more tax dollars to try to help people who need more help. Taxes and government spending increase as a result of this because they need more money to actually do it. In the 70s, you have an economic recession, which is a bad thing. Prices increase, and there's an oil shortage due to chaos in the Middle East. We kind of talked about that last week. So the government's not doing well. People aren't doing that well in the 70s. In the 50s, you also have a lot of fears. You have something called the Red Scare. It's the fear of communism in America. So, belief that there is communist spies in America. So, an example of this would be Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were two people in the United States. They were convicted and killed for supposedly leaking atomic bomb secrets to Russia. So, they were accused of being spies, and then they were sentenced to death. And then you have McCarthyism. This one's pretty crazy. It turns out to be a witch hunt. If you've ever read the play The Crucible, it's based off the Salem witch trials, but it came out around this time because of McCarthyism. So you have a senator, his name is Joseph McCarthy. He claims he has a list of Soviet spies that have infiltrated the U.S. government. He goes on these big speeches, he waves around this list, and he freaks everyone out. So he says that they're going to identify communist spies and arrest them. He plays off the fear of the people, and he actually falsely accuses a lot of people in the government of being communists. He ruins their careers. Some people go to jail, and he just kind of stirs up chaos. Well, he started accusing army officials, and they started calling him out on his lies, and everything he claimed is found out to be false. He made up the whole thing. He cost people their careers and their reputations. And he's not a good guy. I think he dies of alcohol poisoning alone. So, karma kind of came back and got him. Here's a picture of Joseph McCarthy, though, for you, giving a speech, accusing people of doing things that they didn't do. You also have the Civil Rights Movement, which you guys are going to talk more about that in American history when you take that next year, or if you're taking honors the year after. So, you have a push for equality for all Americans. One of the big court cases in this is Brown versus Board of Education. So at the time, everything was still segregated by race. So Brown versus Board of Education integrated the schools. It ruled that people are not separate. It is not okay to have separate but equal facilities. Public schools are going to be integrated. That means kids of all races are going to go ahead and go to school together. You also have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and you guys have all heard of him. He is a civil rights leader of the civil rights movement. He did protests, marches, speeches, boycotts. He went to Supreme Court hearings. He aimed at ending segregation and discrimination, so that way black people and white people would be equal. Here's a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You have all seen him many times before. All right. Let's talk a little bit about Great Britain, because they kind of had the same problems in a way. You have political party divisions. You have the Labour Party versus the Conservative Party. So after World War II, British people voted Labour Party into power over the Conservative Party that had held the country during the war. So they switched political parties. Belief that the Labour Party would provide better help with recovery efforts. Because you have to think about Great Britain did take some pretty heavy hits during World War II, especially since Germany bombed them. The Labour Party created a welfare state and they increased government-sponsored aid, unemployment insured, and old age pensions. So they helped give the people more money. The British government nationalized or took control of major industries. So they built housing for the poor and provided free and low-cost medical care. This freaked out America because it meant that the government was in charge of a lot of the industries. And when the government's in charge of the industries, you get closer and closer to communism. 70s. So due to the welfare state that the Labour Party created, the taxes in Great Britain rose tremendously. Nothing is actually free. If the government gives you money, that means it's coming out of your taxes, and it's going to make your taxes go up. So then the worldwide recession hits because the oil prices increase, and people are not having a good time. You combine this with issues to a change in leadership to the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party looks to cut costs, eliminating some of the welfare programs so the taxes can go back down. Economic strains leads to the development of the Common Market, which is now the European Union. It's a big trade union between European countries, and it is still in effect today. So, you also have global leadership. After World War II, the British Empire began to shrink as their colonies fought for and won independence. So, they had colonies all around the world. One of the big ones was India, but that one was independent a little bit more. But they started losing all of their land. So, the sun no longer set everywhere on the British Empire. So, the United States is going to be the new global leader. Though Britain is still involved in a lot of things. France. They also have economic challenges of recovery because they were taken over during World War II. So, they're in pretty much ruins because Germany took over. They accept the Marshall Plan funds, so they did get some money from the United States. They put General Charles de Gaulle, he was a war hero, in charge of the country. So, like Britain, France's government nationalized. They took over some of the industries and expanded social welfare benefits. They created a welfare state like Great Britain. Taxes rise dramatically. Pretty much the same thing happens. In the 1980s and 90s, the French government took a more conservative approach to cut government spending due to tax rises. So they debated on how much the government spending should be spent on welfare programs has continued to this day. The French government is, every once in a while they have these big uprisings. It's nowhere near like French Revolution style, but sometimes they can have a lot of riots. But they're figuring it out. So, global challenges. France emerged from World War II severely weakened and began to lose control of its colonies around the world. They lost parts of Africa, including its largest country of Algeria. They lost places in Vietnam, and attempts to end hostility and develop new relationships with West Germany. So, France kind of loses everything, and they have to focus more on the mainland than their colonies. Alright, so a couple other ones. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark all developed extensive social welfare programs. Taxes rose. Since the 90s, constant debate has plagued democratic nations on how much taxes should be used to pay for such welfare programs. So the Nordic countries plus Denmark had to kind of figure that one out. Italy was struggling due to a multi-party political system, coalition governments, which led to many changes in the government control. Long and slow economic recovery after World War II. Italy, it took them a little bit longer to kind of bounce back on their feet. Spain and Portugal, dictators clung to their power for decades. In the 70s, Franco and Salazar died and were replaced with more democratic governments. So the only way they got out of dictatorships was the dictator just died. And then they put someone else in charge who wasn't as power hungry. Alright, Germany. So, post-World War II, Germany was in ruins. People were starving. The landscape was pretty much ruined. And then they were divided into those 4 zones, which the Western zone, so Britain, France, and the United States, that's kind of just one zone. And then you have the Soviet Union, which is communist. So, in 1949, due to emerging Cold War, Germany was divided into West Germany, which was controlled by NATO, so that's your democratic states, and East Germany, your Warsaw Pact, or communists. The Soviet Union opposed a united Germany that might threaten Soviet security. So, they kind of wanted to use East Germany as a buffer zone. That's kind of like the Iron Curtain dividing them. The United States reached aid to its former enemy to strengthen them against communist influence. So that was like the Berlin airlift. They're trying to help them out to get away from the Soviet Union. So you have a couple different like beliefs with each side. So West Germany, you have a guy named Konrad Adenauer. He was sponsored by the U.S. He becomes the chancellor. They also take money from the Marshall Plan. They rebuild cities, factories, and they increase trade. They implement social welfare programs like the other democracies to try to help people out. People thrived and the economy recovered. Made communism look bad because they weren't recovering. In East Germany, the Soviet Union kind of ran everything. Their economy stagnated, so it didn't grow. It wasn't getting any better. Cities were still laying in ruins. Workers in the industries were exploited for the Soviet Union's benefit, pretty much like they would make things and the Soviet Union would take them. East Germany was also forced to pay reparations to the Soviet Union, so that means they were forced to pay for damage in the war. Due to the thriving society in the West, especially with Berlin, the Soviet Union built the Berlin Wall to stop people from escaping and going back to West Germany. So pretty much West Germany was the fun place to be. East Germany, you didn't have anything, you didn't have any money, and everything sucked. They also wouldn't let you have anything from like Western culture. Like in East Germany, you couldn't have jeans and like the Beatles. They cut off culture as well. So, just to remind you, here are those 4 zones. In the red, that is East Germany, and that's all controlled by the Soviet Union. Reunification. So, beginning in 1969, West Germany's chancellor, his name was Willy Brandt, signed treaties with the Soviet Union and Poland in an attempt to ease tensions and work towards reunification. It didn't work that well. In 1989, as the Soviet communism declined, Germany was able to move towards unification. So the Soviet Union starts to fail miserably. So they can now reunify Germany. So without the Soviet Union backing East Germany, communist leaders were ousted. They were gotten rid of. In 1990, German voters approved unification. And Helmut Kohl, he became the chancellor of United Germany. So, prosperous West Germany had to pay taxes to finance the building in the East, and East Germans faced a different transition to a market economy. They had to kind of change their whole way of life, so that's kind of hard for people. Here's a picture of them about to take down the Berlin Wall. When they took this thing down, like, if you lived on the west side and your family lived on the east side, you couldn't get over there to see them for almost 30 years. So when this wall came down, families were also unified, and they literally started, like, taking hammers to it and knocking it down. Alright, the European Union, which is still in effect today. So, Western European nations developed an alliance system known as the European Union. It is a common market. European communities are in it, and it still exists today. They have the same currency, except for a couple countries like Britain. They still use their own. But it's one big alliance. The goal of the alliance is to work together to end tariffs, so taxes on trade goods, and to move goods more freely across European borders. You also don't need to show your passport if you're part of the European Union and you're going to a different country in the European Union. You can also work in other places and not have to pay taxes. Okay, so the euro is the currency used in many of the European countries today, except for Great Britain, but Britain's trying to leave the European Union, so we'll have to see where that one goes, because they've been trying for a while now. Alright, so that is the flag of the European Union. And here are a lot of the countries in it. There's a lot of them, but not all of them. Like, Norway's not in there. Switzerland never wants to be in anything. They're not in there either. So in the 90s and the 200s, the European Union has been on a steady decline. Other nations have gained industrial strength and increased competition. So Japan, China, India have all become industrialized, so that's more competition for Europe. You have outsourcing, so developing nations have offered cheaper labor, so people have been moving their factories to those countries instead. And you also have developing countries suffering job losses. A lot of developed countries, so like countries who have like big infrastructure, they don't rely as much on factories as they used to. They're becoming more of a service industry. Alright, so now we need to take down the communists in the Soviet Union. So let's get rid of them. Just to remind you, that is the Soviet Union. All of the other countries that are highlighted are called their satellites, so it's land that they controlled. So, some causes that of the Soviet Union collapse. The Cold War led to high military spending, so they focused on spending all their money in science and technology, and the rest of the country was poor. So they didn't actually help out the people, they tried to help out science. Civilians experienced severe economic troubles, so you have a low output of crops, and consumer goods. So you don't have food, you don't have clothes. You had shortages on all those things in medicine and fuel. It leads to social unrest inside the country over the course of 45 years. So people were just continuously struggling and struggling and struggling for 45 years. And then you have Soviet Union's Vietnam. They started a war in Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviets tried to modernize the government and threaten Afghan landlords' power and Islamic traditions. So they tried to kind of take over and put their own government in. The Battle of Mojaved, and I said that wrong, where you have Muslim warriors in mountains in Afghanistan, and they were taking out the Soviets. It was a long and costly war for the Soviets, and it was a crisis among the people of the Soviet Union. So this is something they never should have done. They had other ethnic and nationalist movements inside the country as well. You had uprisings continuously to happen through the Soviet Republic. Denial of rights and freedoms to the people and various ethnic groups inside the Soviet Union just made matters worse because people were just continuously getting more angry at the Soviet Union government. So, here are some soldiers in Afghanistan. So, in 1985, you get new leadership. You get a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. He is going to get rid of the other two, and he is going to be the new guy. He's pretty recognizable. He has a big birthmark on his head. So, he is more open to democratic ideas. So, Glasnost is ending of censorship, and people are encouraged to discuss the country's problems. So, you gain more freedom of speech. You also have reshaping of the economy and government. That one is perestroika. The government allows some businesses to be owned privately. So they're shifting more away from communism and more towards having a free market. So they're kind of being more democratic in a way. Alright, effects and reforms implemented in 1985. So, some economic challenges they face. The slow transition to the market economy in Russia. A true command economy no longer exists. You have conflicts begin to uprise between pro-communist and pro-democratic groups. With Glasnost, the freedom to express and allow others groups to exist is not a very communist thing. Minority groups start to revolt and civil conflict erupts, and you have riots in the streets. People wanting more independence, especially those satellite countries. So, 1989 through 1990, the Soviet Union broke up into 15 republics, so it finally just snapped. The Russian Republic approved a new constitution, and now you have the country of Russia. In 89 through 90, that's the official end of the Cold War. The U.S. was left as the only superpower. After the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. is now the strongest. Alright, so what happened to everybody else? So as the Soviet Union disbanded and broke apart, others started to follow suit. So communist groups in Eastern European nations were left to fend for themselves after the Soviet Union fell. So in 1989, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania regained their independence since 1940. Good for them. Romania, freedom protests were answered with violence, and dictators were arrested and executed. So theirs was a little bit more of a violent turnover. Poland, free elections were held for the first time since before World War II in Poland. Hungary, Communist Party breaks apart, moves more to democracy. Czechoslovakia, free elections held for the first time since before World War II. Bulgaria, communist leaders realized that he is a minority and stepped down from power, probably afraid that the people were going to kill him if he didn't. Yugoslavia, the Communist Party control comes to an end. Promises of free election is fulfilled. East Germany, the Berlin Wall falls, 1989. Free elections and votes for unity in 1990. So, there is your picture of Europe. Pretty much everybody in the East now is going to have freedom. So, what about the other communist countries? So, places like China. So, in China, they refused to change its government from communism, but adopted a market-like economy and built some relationships around the world. They become an economic powerhouse in the modern world. So, they're still communist, but they do have a couple, like they do have a more market-like economy, but they're still communist. Do not go into China and try to use free speech. They don't have it there. In Vietnam, they opened its country up to new world relations, and they're starting to do some reforms and having some success there. North Korea refuses to change its government or economy. They face grim isolation and sanctions, so no one trades with them. From other countries around the world, hundreds of thousands of North Koreans had died of starvation and malnourishment since the 1990s. We've talked a lot about North Korea. They're still struggling. Kim Jong-un is still in charge, though I did hear he had surgery and he's not doing very well after it, so who knows where that's going to go there. He does have a son, but I think he's like 8. So North Korea, not a good place to go. They didn't change anything. It's still a communist dictatorship. Cuba. Castro refuses to reform the government too. They are still technically communist. Economic struggles continue to this day in Cuba. The Castro family does plan to step aside in the near future. Fidel Castro, he was the first dictator there. He did die, but his brother Raul is in charge now, and he's not as hardcore as his brother Fidel. So we'll have to see where Cuba is going. The U.S. is trying to work on relations with Cuba. Alright guys, so that is it for the notes on the Cold War. It all really ends when the Soviet Union falls. So you're going to have more notes questions, and then next week we're going to do a different assignment. And that is it.